Today's episode is sponsored by my friends at the Lone Star Cowboy Poetry Gathering. The Lone Star Cowboy Poetry Gathering is held on the beautiful campus of Sul Ross State University in Alpine, Texas. The event is a gathering of some of the nation's top cowboy poets and musicians. The 2025 gathering will be held on February 20th, 21st, and 22nd. I hope to see you there. Come join our campfire for the best in authentic cowboy music and poetry. You can learn more about the Lone Star Cowboy Poetry Gathering online at lonestarcowboypoetry.com. Today we are celebrating 100 episodes of Cowboy Crossroads. It's hard to believe that I've made it this far, and I just want to say thank you to all of the folks who have helped to make this happen. All of my sponsors, all of my Patreon supporters, all of the wonderful folks who've graciously allowed me to interview them, and all of you who faithfully listen to the show. I couldn't do it without you, and I thank you for your support. To celebrate, we've got some Cowboy Crossroads t-shirts and hats with the new logo by Dirk Fowler, and those are available for purchase at andyhedges.com. I'd like to start today's show with a poem written by today's guest. This is a poem that I've been reciting since I was a kid, and it was written by Waddie Mitchell, and it's entitled, The Whole Load. In a western town in the days of old, before the mines closed down for the lack of gold, the folks there seized opportunity and built them a right smart community. They built them a school where the R's was taught, and they built them a church on a corner lot, and they painted her white with the steeple high to greet town folks as they's passing by. They had 'em a sheriff, a judge, and a mayor, but they needed a preacher to make things square, so they sent back east, as was the general rule, and hired one fresh from divinity school. Now when Sunday come, he was all decked out to preach a sermon, whisper and shout, but when he stepped up to the podium, it was all too obvious that no one come, except one old cowboy in his pew back there, in his Sunday shirt and his greased-down hair. He just sat there quiet and stared at the floor with an occasional glance towards the church's doors. Time stood still for the longest while, until the preacher coughed and faked a smile. I guess we could try it again next week, but emotion reigned. He could hardly speak. His demeanor was that of a scolded pup, and he turned to leave when old Jake spoke up. "Now hold on there, preacher, 'tain't your fault, and them there doors ain't like no vault, for there ain't no locks to keep folks out, and if you don't preach now, old Satan's won the bout. Now, if I was to haul out a whole load of hay, and only one cow showed up, she'd get fed that day." Well, this preaching man for the last few days had found it hard to cope with these western ways, but he figured as how he had found his call from this profound man with his western drawl, so he fixed his collar and he stood up straight and began to expound on the pearly gates. And he amazed himself at his own recall of that book he waved, chapter, verse, and all. It was God Almighty's omnipotent power that he lectured on for over an hour. Then the wages of sin, then the hell's brimfire, and he didn't weaken and he didn't tire, and he was jumping and screaming and pounding the floor when, well, he noticed old Jake weren't awake anymore. This made him mad. He went to the pew, he shook Jake's shoulder, he said, "I weren't through. You're the one told me about that cow getting fed, and now here you're acting like you're home in bed." "Well, you're right there, preacher, about them things I told you, and it still hold true. That cow would get fed. Why, it's the cowman's code. But I wouldn't feed her the whole darn load." Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry and culture from the working cowboy West and beyond. My guest today is the legendary cowboy poet from Elko County, Nevada, Waddie Mitchell. Waddie was my very first guest on episodes 1 and 2 of Cowboy Crossroads, and so I thought it would be fitting to have Waddie back on for episode 100. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to go back and listen to those first 2 episodes where Waddie talks about his early cowboy days and growing up with the cowboy poetry tradition on the big outfits of Nevada. I recorded this interview with Waddie on stage in front of a live audience at the Lone Star Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Alpine, Texas on February 16th. I started this interview by asking Waddie to talk about his habit of calling interesting folks on the phone when he was a young buckaroo in Nevada. Here's Waddie Mitchell.
Well, you got to realize I lived on a ranch, very remote, and brought up there. We didn't have a phone. We did have an old crank phone, but it just went to the neighbor. And I guess if somebody got really hurt, we could call them and tell them, I don't know. We had a good time, though. We really did. We went out on the wagons. And those old chuck wagons, you'd go out there. Sometimes it'd be a 6-week month before you got back to town. And of course, I was just like, I went on the wagon the first time when I was 16, and I didn't have experience with a phone. And so we'd come into town, the whole crew would be there, and I wasn't old enough to go take a drink with these guys, so I'd get a pocket full of quarters and just go call people up. I didn't know it wasn't to be done. And I really like Kris Kristofferson. I think he's a heck of a poet. And my sister, for my 17th birthday, had given me a double album of Kris Kristofferson songs this was before anybody cut any of them. And so we didn't have electricity, but they was nice enough when you open that thing up, all the lyrics were there. So I met him as a poet. I called up, I didn't know how to get a hold of him, but I called up Capitol Records. They had a phone number down there at the bottom with their logo. And I called them up and I said, yeah, is Kris Kristofferson there? They said, not right now. I said, oh. They said, well, we could give you his home phone. We think he's home. So they did. I called him up and I just told him, he's probably wondering, what the hell, who gave you this number? But he was really nice. He really was. And especially when he started asking me questions, found out I was an old-time cowboy. He really liked that idea. One time out of the 3 times, I can't remember which one, but that I did that Johnny Carson show, they kept us at a hotel, and when we got back there, it was the last time because it was Baxter Black and I. And we went downstairs, we got a phone call saying they want you downstairs, so we went down to the bar. It was really a bar underneath the hotel, and it was attached to a restaurant. But in the bar, there was about 8 guys in there. And within 15 minutes, Baxter Black had all their first name and knew him. And they all loved him. And there was a guy out in the corner. The bartender said, this fellow out there in the corner wants to meet you. And it was dark. I couldn't see who it was. I went over there and stood there and said, howdy. The bartender said, you want to talk to me? He said, yeah, we've talked before. I'm Kris Kristofferson. And so we had a real nice deal, and he just really liked the idea there were still cowboys. I'm sure he had lots of people that wanted to visit with him, but something about being a cowboy tickled him. I had a book called Rawhide Rhymes by S. Omar Barker. S. Omar Barker, I didn't know from Adam, But I was reading his poetry and I really liked it. So another time in town, I give him a call. And he told me, Waddie, I'm not a cowboy. He said, I admire cowboys, but I'm not. I'm an academic. And I've been in academia my whole life, my whole career. And so he said, I'm really glad that a real cowboy wants to read these poems of mine. And of course, I couldn't praise him enough. And we talked about either 2 or 3 times after that. And we talked enough to where when I'd call him up, he'd go, hello, Waddie, you know. And this was before cell phones and stuff to tell you who's there. He again was just more than willing to talk and ask how things happened out in Nevada, ask how things happened, in Texas and all these different things. And of course, I couldn't tell him anything but Arizona and Nevada. And I asked him a lot of questions about some of the things he was talking about. He said, well, I've learned all these from the guys that work on the ranch. And he says, so I'm not sure they were doing it right. I said, oh, I think so. I just didn't ever know about it. And once I asked some of these other cowboys, they said, yeah, he was right about that. We used to all call it that, but now we call it something else. You know, he called it a holdup. And we call it a roe deer when you bunch of cattle and work them outside with no fences around. And so I was tickled about that. Of course, I'd never been around bears any, and he wrote a lot about funny things that happen with bears. So that's what I was asking him. He told me about his family, and he told me about New Mexico, up around Las Vegas, New Mexico. And, well, of course, you know that. You went up there and have done a bunch of studying on him, haven't you?
I have been there. I got to visit the old Barker homestead, and I interviewed his grandniece when she was still with us, lovely lady named Georgia Sneed. And if any of you are passing through Las Vegas, the public library there's a S. Omar Barker room with a lazy SOB chandelier. And unfortunately, the librarian didn't know about the room, but I looked around and found it, and it's nice to stop in and see.
Well, that's cool. He was one of these guys that never made it big. He should have, but his books was lucky to pay for themselves. And as sad as that is, he was fine with it. He says, as long as the cowboys get it, that's all I care about.
Well, that's a good lead into my next question. Waddie, you were the first guy I ever heard recite a S. Omar Barker poem, Cascadin', all these classics that are really the foundation of what we're all doing out here and what we're celebrating. And I feel like you have a special insight into those early writers because you learned them from this oral tradition. And I wonder if you might talk about the kind of poems you were hearing growing up and kind of who you think of as maybe the top 3 writers of the, what we all consider classic cowboy poetry, and why they're important to you. Why did their words ring true?
Well, the school I went to as a kid was a one-room schoolhouse. Had one year they had 11. One year they were down to 8. And you had to keep at least 8 students or they'd come and close that school down. We had one school marm, and she'd take care of all these classes. I'm not saying there was all 8 classes going there because the way the kids are, there might be 2 or 3 in one class. But she'd come and take care of the 2nd grade and the 3rd or 4th, whatever, and kind of take care. And then in the afternoon, she'd read to us. She'd read poems when it came to it, and she'd read The Cremation of Sam McGee. She'd read Casey at the Bat. She'd read The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. She'd read poems like that would just take a bunch of kids in her class and scare them, tickle them, but they all loved, everybody that was in that school loved poetry. And not that they ever went into it and read it or even wrote it, but everybody did it. I think if every teacher now would read good poetry to them, maybe this wouldn't be such a strange phenomena with these folks coming in some cases quite a ways to listen to poetry the way I think it was meant to be written. I think poetry is supposed to be. I was told at one time by this teacher that poetry was word music, and I just always remembered that. And I found out that good writers like Kris and S. Omar Barker and Badger Clark and it just goes on and on. When these guys would write, it wasn't to where you'd have to go back and forth and read it again to understand what they were saying. It was more like she said, music. And it just pleased the ear, it pleased the mind, and it made me a believer.
Waddie Mitchell was a full-time cowboy for 26 years before his career as a professional cowboy poet. After helping to start the Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada, and appearing on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, it became clear that he was going to have to make a decision to either continue his life as a working cowboy or leave that behind to earn his living on the road as an entertainer. He wrote a poem during that time of his life entitled Where to Go. The last stanza of the poem says this: "So the moral to this little story is when your mind is all clouded with doubt, go out on the mountain to ponder. It's there that you'll figure things out."
I was in my late 40s, and as a young man, I thought riding bucking horses was fun, and I thought fighting wild cattle was fun. I thought getting in rough country was fun. And I didn't realize that it was going to take a toll on my body, and my back was just about done when Michael Martin Murphey come along. And he said, "You ought to go out there and do this professionally." I said, "I couldn't. I'm nothing but a cowboy." And he said, "Well, that's what people's going to want to see." And he started taking me out and putting me in stages where a lot of people were there, and they were going like, "What the hell's he doing?" But you put a few comedy poems out there to them, and all of a sudden they like you. And all of a sudden I like this. It was a whole lot better than working your tail off to get paid. I started doing it. And then I wondered, what am I doing? Am I selling out? Am I setting a precedence? Or am I just going to go out there and flicker out in a year or two, and I've already left the ranch, so what else can I be doing? And it just worked out. Everything, people would see it, and you'd start getting calls to come here, come there, everything from speaking after dinner to conventions to little concerts. You just go do whatever they took, and they call that giving before you get.
When you look back over all those years, for a guy that didn't have a phone, the places this has taken you to, the people you've met, the stages you've been on, could you speak to that a bit about just the the way cowboy poetry has taken you to the world, and you've introduced this tradition to the world.
Well, people are funny. If you're on the Johnny Carson show, you must be good. And so they wouldn't even judge it. You wouldn't, a lot of people you'd go work for, just like sitting in the audience there. Here's a couple old boys, just go ahead and try to entertain me, just give it a try. And if you could, they became great fans because they didn't like anything else, even themselves, I don't think they liked. But it was, it took me from Carnegie Hall to Europe to the Bass Hall in Fort Worth with the symphony, and we just got very, very lucky. The symphony part of it, they were having a hard time getting people to come and listen to symphonies, so they started what they call pop series, and so they'd have us there and they'd advertise it. And you saw a lot of boots and hats coming to the symphony where they never saw that before.
Waddie Mitchell has made many recordings of his poetry over the years, including 3 albums for Warner Brothers. Most of these albums include elaborate arrangements and musical accompaniment that elevated Waddie's recitations to another level. One of my favorite cowboy poetry albums of all time is Waddie's live recording that is simply entitled Waddie Mitchell Live. It was produced by the great Don Edwards and features musical backup by 2 of the best guitar players of all time, Rich O'Brien and Norman Blake. In the liner notes to that album, Don Edwards said this: "For as long as I can remember, Waddie would always be telling me how he never liked poetry records, including his own. He never believed the true meaning and spirit could be captured on a recording, but he did believe that music and poetry were close kin. I agreed. After all, it worked for Jack Kerouac and David Amram, so why not Waddie Mitchell, and put him with 2 of my all-time favorite and legendary players, Rich O'Brien and Norman Blake."
Well, I wish I could take credit for that you just said about a nice record with everybody playing. It wasn't me. It was the record executives. It was the record producer, and I just kind of went along with it. I'm not sure that I'd have ever done that. Afterwards, I thought, hey, this is good, and then I never wanted to do it again without it. But no, the produced end result was just not my doing. I wish it was. I'd bring in about 40 poems and do them, and then they'd pick which ones they'd do, and then they'd add the music and stuff to it. So it wasn't like I thought it up and did it. It really surprised me, though, when poetry is written right, you can recite it, and a musician can follow along with a guitar or a piano. They can follow it. It is that sing-song, you might say, although sing-song is something people that recite poetry do their best to stay away from. They don't want to da-dee-da-dee-da, dee-da-dee-da-dee-da. They'd way rather have you just talk through it like it was conversational. And these guys made it a song. I'd never been around music. I'd never been around anything live, except for on the bar at the Stockman's Hotel. They'd have a little stage above there, and they'd have, some little music going. And that was about the most music I ever heard live. Other than that, it was on the 78, and it was Hank Snow. Or it was Montana Slim. Remember them? Yeah. And so that's about all I knew about music. And then I got, what's his name that wrote El Paso?
Marty Robbins.
Oh, Marty Robbins. Yeah, I got a Marty Robbins record, and that's where I learned the Strawberry Roan. And as soon as I learned the Strawberry Roans and did it, somebody said, "Hey, Grandpa had this book," and would send me a Curly Fletcher book. And that was another way I got started, was these guys that went before me. And once I started reciting their stuff, it just became easier and easier to write because it was in your head the way they did it. I could take just a decent, pretty song and make it body. I could just make a nice one, nasty as can be. And people said, "Well, at least you did a good job of writing it." But then I started, actually, it was once I started having kids and looking at it and looking at life and finding humor in the real life world, not write off a joke. That's when I wanted to start, but I never had time. I might write 2, 3 a year for a long time. And then all of a sudden, I started getting into it, and I'd write 8 a year. Over COVID, I've never had time. I was always go, go, go. And over COVID, I had all this time. And I'd get up in the morning, start writing, and then quit writing when I had to, whether it be 8 o'clock in the evening or 11. And I'd write, and I thought, I'm going to burn myself out, but 400 pieces come out of that in 2.5 years. And it's still not out of me. I still want to be home writing every chance I get.
Waddie Mitchell has collaborated with many artists in his career. He's written songs with people like Dave Stamey, Bryn Hill, Pip Gillette, and yours truly. But I think his most important collaboration was that with his longtime friend and partner, Don Edwards. Waddie and Don performed for many years in a duo show that they called The Bard and the Balladeer, and their live Warner Brothers album by the same name is a favorite of most all of us who discovered cowboy poetry and music in the 1990s. I asked Waddie how he came to start working with Don Edwards.
Gary Martin, the great artist, painter, Gary Morton. Yeah. And he brought Don to Elko. I think it was the second year of the gathering. He said, "You got to come see this. This is different than anything we've ever seen." And he brought Don out, who Don had, at that time, was playing at the White Elephant, and he'd go in there 4-hour sets and sit there and play without a break. And although Fort Worth loved him, outside of Fort Worth, nobody knew him. And he'd put a record out, and in the back of Frontier magazine, there was a little ad about cowboy songs. And I looked it up, and I never heard of this guy, but I sent off for it. And this is still vinyl days. And by golly, I loved his songs, and we just kind of hit it off. We went up and down the road 24 years, I think, straight, and never had a harsh word. Never had a harsh word. I love the guy, and I miss him terribly.
Waddie is known for his recitations of other people's work, like Bruce Kiskadden's When They Finish Shipping Cattle in the Fall, and Bill Hershey's The Brawl. But he's also added to the cowboy poetry tradition by writing his own poetry. I asked Waddie if he would reflect on some of his poems that stand out from his body of work.
Well, I'd have to say they're three that actually I wrote quite a while ago. And one is about my daughter growing up and going to a dance. I take her to a dance. That meant a lot to me, and it still means a lot to her. When I do it in front of her, she still cries, and she's, at that time she was 16, and now she's like 47. And so if that still makes her cry, and lots of people come up and say that's my favorite. I think another one would be Evening Chat, which is nothing more than a visit with a horse after a day's work. And it just kind of says a lot about knowing so little about the world beyond those mountains towards town. And that just makes a lot of people come up and say that's their favorite. But I've written quite a few about friends, old-time friends. And I wrote one about Shorty Daniels. Shorty Daniels was from Arizona. He'd moved up to Nevada when he was quite 30 years old or something. And he went to work for the outfits around there. He'd never done anything but be a cowboy. And he worked for these outfits, and when I got to work with him on the 7S ranch, we became fast friends. And so it goes like this. When I first met up with Shorty, I was 16 and abrupt. I'd been raised around cows and horses, thought I knew which way was up. I'd landed a job on the 7S. I'd hired out to Buckaroo. I was to pull out with the wagon. Shorty Daniels was on the crew. He was old already, little, thin, and unassuming, and the flame that burned his passion for the cowboy life was all-consuming. And I can't help but remember as I sit here and reflect how that man who wore the Blanchard spurs had gained that crew's respect. At night sometimes, he'd talk about his mother, school, and home, and how at 14 years of age, he'd set out on his own. You see, he'd aimed to be a cowboy. So he worked free for a ranch, mucking stalls and digging post holes till he'd earned himself a chance. Then how he'd worked in Arizona, popping brush and tying off, spending winters on a camp job where the trails were awful rough. Then how he'd come out to Nevada where he'd spent those many years, and he'd think again of mother, and his eyes would fill with tears, for he'd say, I never made it back to see her, for she died. And regrets he had about that were impossible to hide. I just thought him sentimental, old, and foolish in his ways. You see, being young, I thought life was an endless wealth of days. He'd talk of ranches and cowboys and different places he'd worked on, but his stories seemed prehistoric, because now most of them were gone. He'd talk of friends he'd like to see in places that he'd been, and how come fall he's going to take some time, go visit them again. But something always happened, and he'd never really go, except his yearly junket to the Denver Livestock Show. 'Cause work and life tied Shorty down, doing things he thought he should. Just weren't time to get around like he'd always wished he could. And on occasion, he'd get word that some old pal had died. He'd say, damn, I could have seen him, but I didn't really try. And if that feller's name come up in a story later on, Shorty'd pause and blink a tear, say, I really should have gone. In the paper yesterday, it hurt me when I read that Shorty Daniels passed away while sleeping in his bed. Oh, I'd heard how Shorty had been sick and wasn't doing well, and I figured I'd take some time, go visit him a spell. But, well, I never made it before old Shorty died. Damn, I could have seen him, but I didn't really try. And that made me start to think about some things on my back shelf, like friends I haven't seen for years, and how history repeats itself. Outfits that I've worked at have sold out and are no more, and I'm starting now to understand what Shorty choked up for. Oh, I suppose it's in the scheme of things. We'll all have some regrets, and I reckon it's just one more thing that living life begets. But I'll bet when Shorty's name comes up in a story later on, I'll likely pause, blink a tear, and say I really should have gone.
All right, folks, that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Waddie Mitchell for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Waddie at waddiemitchell.com. I'd like to thank the Lone Star Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Alpine, Texas for sponsoring today's episode. You can find out more about the Lone Star Cowboy Poetry Gathering at lonestarcowboypoetry.com. I'd like to thank Hal Cannon for playing the Cowboy Crossroads theme music. You can find out more about Hal at halcannon.com. I'd like to thank my Trail Boss patrons Bob Kelly, Chris Ryden, and Scott Anderson for their support of this episode. If you're enjoying Cowboy Crossroads and would like to help me keep it going, you can become a patron at patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. That's patreon.com/Cowboy Crossroads. You can also make a donation on my website at andyhedges.com. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.